Beautiful. So welcome everybody to the How We Heal series. Today we're going to be discussing fear. We have with us panelists Michelle Meehan, Nick Vait, and Miranda Borisenko. The format for today, we're going to be giving the floor to each of the panelists, 3 to 5 minutes to introduce themselves, what brings them to the topic of fear, and describe a little bit about their practice and how fear has come up for them. After that, I have a couple of curated questions that we'll get the ball rolling with, and then we'll open the floor to all the audience participants to hear from you what your questions are. So the whole extent of today's panel is scheduled for 90 minutes, and we'll close with a summary, and of course, access to all of these presenters to connect with them individually when the session is complete. So I'm just really happy to have you all here. We're really taking a step forward by having these conversations. There's a lot of fear present in the hearts and minds of individuals and families on many different levels. And if we're going to transform it and shift it, we need to really understand it and have these conversations as families, as communities, really looking at our role in how we shape how we move forward. So without further ado, I would like to start with Michelle Meehan. Michelle, would you mind introducing yourself and your practice and what brings you to the topic of fear and how it's showing up for you in your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. So I'm a psychotherapist, and I specialize in doing integrative breath work, which is, for those of you who are familiar with breath work, it's a close cousin of holotropic breath work or rebirthing. Some people are more familiar with those. I also work as a shamanic practitioner, and I would say, one of the core parts of my approach to work is helping people develop emotional fluency. And that's, helping people understand the nature of whatever emotion they're feeling and develop some capacity for, first of all, really being with it and feeling it, the sensation of it, and then strategies for healthy expression, as well as transformation of the emotion. So I work, the breath actually works on both of those. So sometimes we use the breath to help stoke the fire and bring up emotion in its full intensity so it can be released and transformed and then integrated. Sometimes we use the breath to help activate the parasympathetic system to calm. And I have found it really important to help people kind of at both ends of the spectrum to really learn how to bring the emotion up as well as to bring it down. And that helps build a sense of capacity that we're really more than any of the emotions that we feel, including fear. And I was called to this topic of fear in particular because I would say it was probably, my biggest teacher through, my own personal growth process, and still kind of the default that comes up. So, we all have kind of our go-to responses, and that those come from, our personal biographical experience. In breathwork, we also talk about our patterns coming from our birth experience. And then we know now that a lot of our patterns will come through our ancestral lineage, because we know through epigenetics that things that our ancestors have experienced do change their DNA. And so we can get kind of encoded with the response that our ancestors have experienced. So, I love working with that whole mix. And in my practice, I work with people to address that full spectrum of their experience. So I'll stop there because I know lots more will come out through our conversation. So you're muted, Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Miranda?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Melanie. So I have a mixed background like many of the other panelists. My first kind of training was as a social worker. So I have a master's in social work and did a lot of work early in my professional life in community mental health clinics. I worked with children, youth, and families in mental health, and then also worked with women in shelters and survivors of sexual assault and childhood sexual abuse. So my early work was in mental health and in helping people heal and recover from post-traumatic stress. So, you know, laying with that foundation, I also found as a helper and a practitioner that this is very stressful work as a person. And you know, I think Michelle touched on this, is my own journey and path became a little bit awakened where I started to feel anxious and pursued my own recovery and healing for that, and really found yoga and meditation to be extremely healing and helpful for me. But it was slow medicine, it was slow practice, and that led me eventually to becoming a yoga teacher, taking more advanced training in meditation, mindfulness training. And now in my private practice, I can blend the early work that I had done, which is mostly cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, understanding how our thought patterns impact our emotions and our behaviors. And then really trying to observe that and understand that, and then also use breathing and meditation as a way to kind of move past that. So my current practice really integrates both of those, and I sort of really, you know, take my cues from the clients that I work with about what direction they're most needing and comfortable with. But when it comes to fear, you know, I also recognize that many of the participants here, you know, are experiencing a lot of fear for a lot of reasons. And we know, you know, that fear is a very real emotion. It's a real experience. And it's a reaction to real or perceived danger. And I think some of that's the challenge of helping to untangle for us. Is this real and imminent danger as an emotional response? Or is this one that is just a learned response given our culture, our upbringing, as well as our hardwiring as humans? You know, fear is a very survival emotion that triggers us to know when we're under threat, when there's a predator, usually, you know, for our ancestors, the bears and the tigers and the sharks. But in our modern world, those things that trigger us to, you know, trigger the fight or flight or freeze response, which is our survival mechanism, it can really work against us in our modern world. We don't face, most of us, particularly in parts of the world that are developed and peaceful, we don't face those kinds of imminent dangers the way our ancestors did. So the kind of fear response we have is actually harming us. But I do want to make one comment about danger, and because we are pretty far away from the animal predators, many of us do live in real danger. So I just want to acknowledge that some of the participants or listeners, you know, might be living in real and imminent danger, whether it's domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse, survivors of human trafficking. So for those of you who are listening who are experiencing fear and are in imminent danger, please reach out to local resources and crisis lines to get some help. We really can't talk about quelling fear and healing from fear until you're in a safe place. So just to mention that. So, you know, I think that, you know, there's a lot of apps and resources online about meditation and breathing, and I really think that's a universal practice and skill that we can all learn. But when it comes to fear that becomes immobilizing, it interferes with our sleep, our relationships, then I think the approach with a trusted person, a friend, a family member, a therapist, to kind of do that leaning into the fear and move into it. Because for most of us, the fear is mostly in our imagination, in our prior experiences that we're bringing forward. So it is about moving into the fear, leaning into that, feeling the fear, and then getting onto the other side of that, and developing some of the ways to manage that in a way that it feels safe and not so overwhelming that it is immobilizing. So that's some of the approaches that I use and some of the context that I would come from.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Before Nick comes on, I just would like to add to what you just stated. Would you mind in the chat box, all of the participants actually as well, audience members, if there's a resource that you think will help anybody that's facing real and imminent danger right now, a tool, a phone number, if you could please put it in the chat box, I will share that with everybody at the end in the mail out. Okay, so thank you very much, Miranda. Nick?
Okay, so I'm Nick Veet. I'm a past life regression therapist and spiritual biographer. I run workshops around themes of esoteric development and intentionality, which is a hands-on study of how we're configured to our experiences, in particular perception. So that goes all the way from things like sense perception to processes of digestion and even the relationship of symbolism to specific areas of our body and consciousness. So it's very much a study of overlapping relationships and correspondences between subconscious and conscious levels of our experience. So my interest in fear, and what I'm offering today has two facets. So first, I want to explore the reality of fear and how that manifests, particularly in social and political contexts, but also the interrelationships between, or similarities between, fear and intellectualization. So in the mainstream, the word fear has been used much more prevalently in the last 5 or 10 years. It's much more in public consciousness and under public scrutiny, which is a major development in public consciousness in terms of understanding fear as something that operates on an unconscious level, as opposed to just an emotion, just a survival mechanism, something subjective, right? Because we're now seeing political manifestations, we're seeing unconscious patterns that are really affecting and configuring how people end up relating to the world and making important decisions which affect everybody. So looking at fear in its political context is a way of acknowledging its reality in the world. Yeah, so it's not enough. It's not enough to merely acknowledge the public manifestations of fear, because looking at it now as an unconscious factor that configures society, that determines society, we have to take on a personal responsibility from with that same degree of scrutiny that we've applied to politicians and whatnot, right? So with the COVID crisis, a lot of people are starting to ask what's happening behind the scenes, what's going on, and what kind of irreversible changes are taking place. We know that there are definitely changes happening, but what's the permanent historical lasting significance of this event? We know that our lives have changed in many ways. So going forward, what's really going to be the consequences, the lasting consequences of it? What's going to go back to normal? What's not? So I want to draw attention to the fact that a lot of people right now are left with their own devices. They're in their own environments. They're with their families a little more, perhaps, than they used to be. And they're more responsible for things like even their own food and entertainment. So it's placing a strong contrast between self-sufficiency and the ways in which we consume and relate to society as a whole. So that relationship before, which was more invisible to us, it's bringing that social element and putting it right in front of us so that we understand that we have a personal relationship to it that we need to be accountable for. So when it comes to the question of what we're going to do, what's going to change, we should be asking ourselves, how do I need to change? What in particular am I experiencing right now that is no longer acceptable as part of my life and that I need to let go? So when we're asking about the historical significance of this event, we should be paying particular attention to what we're no longer willing or able to accept about how we relate to the world. So I actually have an example of this from my work as a past life regression therapist. I had a client who experienced a lifetime where he, as a child, saw a tiger and tried to warn his village about it. And because of the political order in the village, the chieftain didn't want the inconvenience of a tiger. Disrupting their politics, disrupting the comforts they have, because they would have to mobilize in ways that they didn't necessarily want to. And I think this relates pretty well to, in a metaphorical way, to what's happening right now. People have their own fears, and their own stuff is emerging in a way where they have to look at it. So again, it's getting back to that experience of acknowledging very, very significant and decisive things happening in our own lives that that really place us within the context of that social order that we've come to scrutinize from so many different angles in recent years. But I think that'll go for an introduction for now. There's some things I'd like to touch on a bit later.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. I'm just going to unmute Michelle as well as Miranda. And I have a question for you guys, just to set a little bit of a foundation. What do we have to gain from identifying fear? Like, why do we even have to do this? What do we have to gain by identifying fear in our own and others' decision making? Who would like to start?
I can jump in. So, you know, generally, when we grow through bringing things that are in our unconscious into conscious awareness. And when we do that, we have a deeper understanding of ourselves and our motivations. And so that gives us greater sense of choice over what we do. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I'm going to generalize. And of course, everybody has their own experience. And so, you know, if it fits, great. If it doesn't fit for you, you can let it go. But generally, fear wants to withdraw or contract from things. And so if we've got unconscious fear driving our decisions and our actions in the world, we may be missing a whole lot of opportunities because we're in a contracted place. If we can process that fear and find a way to give it some expression, to kind of let it out, you know, to do our strategies to bring us to a place of calm and centered, we can be much more responsive to life. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So we can find all kinds of opportunities we might not otherwise find.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's excellent points, Michelle. I'll add some reflections on that. I'm reminded of a book that I read many, many years ago. The author is Sylvia Fraser. She was a journalist and then wrote a biography, and she wrote a few books, but this particular one was a biography. She called it My Father's House. And there's a line toward the end of the book that has been seared in my memory ever since. And she says, I'll say it twice just so you can sit with it for a moment. We are born into the second half of a play already in progress. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out what happened in Act One. So we're born into the second act of a play already in progress. And for me, what that means, and it's sort of similar to what Michelle has said, is that, you know, we have our automatic responses, but our awakening into ourselves and how we are happens when we're already kind of in the game. We're already living life. We're already in relationships. So it's, you know, we've all come into a movie late and then whisper to the person next to us, because we were the one that went to get popcorn, what happened? So part of the healing and the therapeutic process is to help people to understand what happened in Act One of their life, and to try to understand what are those automatic unconscious reactions to fear, and then how is that playing out? And you know, when I think of Sylvia Fraser's line, I do hope it doesn't take the rest of our lives to figure out what happened in Act One. I would like to think that we can figure out what happened in Act One, and then also, you know, in some way take some leadership in our life and be more intentional about where our life goes after that. But I do think it's that many of us are living and responding to emotions of fear and not really aware of it, and not aware of the impact until it becomes a crisis, a problem, until it starts to interfere with sleep, health, relationships, and when it becomes immobilizing and harmful. But the kind of moving our understanding from that unconsciousness to awareness and consciousness.
And if I can just add to that, I really love that metaphor of it's, you know, we're coming into the second act. We're coming into a family system that's had its own, you know, kind of norms and responses. And in fact, I mean, it gets passed down generation to generation to generation. So sometimes the patterns that we're born into have very old roots. And we're born into a social context, which is evolving, but also has roots in kind of our history, and our collective experience. And so we part of our becoming conscious is understanding the soup that we're living in, both from our personal, familial, ancestral, and the society we're in. And our society is so driven by fear. It really is kind of all around us.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot for us to unpack.
So I could also jump in here. Talking about and acknowledging fear as an unconscious factor is really a really significant thing, because it takes away the notion that we always have to be shaking or jittering or whatever when we're making a decision based on fear. But we could be doing something as simple as passing a judgment very quickly, because we've in the past simply decided that it should be a certain way and that it needs to be a certain way, and we kind of push that. We could be seeking out comfort or food or even the love of other people. Depression is something that can manifest through a fear state in the long term. So that's one of the most decisive factors we really need to acknowledge. We could live our entire lives in a fear state without ever having screamed about it, and that's something in a way that it's scary, it's sad when we look at it that way. And it's not an easy thing to do, to wake up to the fact that we're not necessarily going to get out of it just by seeing it, but that there's a gradual process where becoming conscious of it, becoming aware of it, slowly brings us into a state of making decisions based on the relationships, the way that the world actually presents itself to us, and coming in to appreciate the manifoldness of experience instead of becoming kind of hard-nosed to everything. We don't think about fear always as you know, being this 18th or 19th century scientist just kind of like scoffing at everything in nature. But there's a serious element of that that's highly represented in the politics today, and that's one of the biggest threats that we have to the planet and to human beings. So it's a very important thing to acknowledge, that it's not just about an emotion, and it's not easy because there's a lot of systemic factors involved.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Michelle and Miranda. I think you guys touched on so many qualities of why it's important to look at fear, both so we can open up to life, so we can make decisions from a clear space and be more conscious about our choices and the judgments that we pass on others, and be more discerning when others are making maybe a decision out of fear as opposed to from a conscious place of expansion or growth or life. And also just the impact long term, as you were pointing out, Nick, with depression and our lineage. You know, if we're inheriting this ancestral link from our ancestors, the work that we do in this life will be passed on and mean that we're helping the future generations as well. And I see, Miranda, that you've shared the quote from Sylvia Fraser in the chat. And also there's some great resources that you shared there. So thank you so much for those. I have one more question, and then I'd like to open this up to the audience. What are some common misconceptions that people have about fear? And how can these misconceptions be dealt with more effectively, whether it's communicating them or dealing with them within ourselves?
So I think I'd like to touch on this one.
Okay.
So I think one of the most common misconceptions about fear is that it's irrational. That's something we hear very often because people want to have a measured approach to whatever they're dealing with. They want to take their emotions and set them aside and look at factors that are less dependent on their current state and their emotions and things. But there's a ramification of decision making that becomes very mechanical, and it goes through an ordered process. It's very step by step, and very often the unconscious element is really the decisive factor for why we're deciding to do a certain thing. We can reason about it, but there's an unconscious element that's present there. So it's important to sit with and acknowledge when other people exhibit fear responses, especially those that are clothed in intellectualism, because it takes a while for those to come to the surface. We can't necessarily battle against the logical content of what a person's saying, and we can't necessarily battle against, we can't necessarily point out that there's something underlying it, but we have to be present with the experience of a person's forming concepts and participate in the level that's available to us at the moment. And it allows us to have a dialogue with the underlying emotional content that really brings forward the element of the other person that might actually be hidden from it, hidden from their decisions, hidden from what they're doing, and hidden from their thought processes and the words they use, the words they hide behind, the words they tend to repeat, and things like that.
Great points, Nick. That's really well put. Thank you. What comes to my mind are a few things. This is an extremely complex topic. I have a feeling like we could spend a lot longer talking about this. But I think one of the things that we sometimes miss is that fear is a gift. It is there to help us to survive. It's for self-preservation. And what we have done with children, and I'm going to speak more from my perspective of working in the violence against women sector, is that we've been told not to listen to our instincts, to push those down, to push down emotions, anger, fear, and by doing that, we don't know sometimes how to trust our own instincts, and it stops us from acting on them. So often people will stay in situations that are dangerous and unsafe because they've been socialized to not listen to their instincts and to push that away. But then there's another completely sort of different perspective on fear, which is the fear of connection and the fear of intimacy. I recall a man I spoke with at length about a time recently where he flew to another province where his mother was living, but she had been admitted to hospital, and she was in her last days, that she was dying, and he wanted to be there at the time of her death with his sisters and brother. And when he came back and he was telling me about being there at the time of her death, he said the thing that he just most wanted to do was to tell her that she was a great mother and that he loved her. And he couldn't do it. He just choked on the emotions and couldn't say it. So we're talking about this emotion that is there for our survival, that, helps us to thrive and survive, yet it also stops us from connecting. So, I really, that his experience really stayed with me as far as what is fear and how it stops us from being authentic with one another and to have real connection with people that we love.
Yeah, and I would say, I think both of you have said it really well, and I don't have a lot to add. The first thing that comes to my mind is, what we've heard is somehow that fear is wrong, and that, yeah, is a misconception. It just isn't so. There's always a truth to it, and it really deserves our attention. But it also deserves our discernment to know the truth of our experience of fear isn't always what we think it is. So, what I mean by that is it's often that our response is rooted in a past experience and disproportionate to maybe our current moment situation. But it's still important to understand the truth of the experience that we're having, but to process that so that we can make a more conscious choice. I think there's a book that's called, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, but sometimes those sound bites make it sound like we just skip over it. And I think that's a really big misconception. It's like it needs our attention. It needs our understanding. It needs us to pause and say, what is this about? How do I come to my center? How do I put myself in a better relationship to this experience of fear, rather than just diving into the experience, whatever it is. So there's this sweet spot where we're not letting the fear stop us from doing something, but we're also not just pretending that it's not there. I think the other misconception I want to name is that we often talk about emotions singularly, but often they come together. And I remember an experience that I had where I got a split second understanding of the relationship for me between fear and anger. So I almost got hit when I was driving my car. Somebody was blowing through a stop sign, and I had that like fleeting experience of fear, and then right on its heels, I felt this anger. How dare you? And I went, oh, that that's I knew in that moment that that happens a lot, that those times that the presentation is anger, is right underneath it is fear. And I think that that again bears kind of when we're angry, we want to say, is there something underneath this? And might it be fear?
Wow, thank you so much. I do have one question that's come through. It was sent to me privately, so I'm not sure if if they would like their name to be shared. What do we do to cultivate? What do we cultivate in opposite to fear?
So I can jump in on that. I think if we cultivate our capacity to be like grounded, centered, and have present moment awareness, that goes a long way to shifting our perspective in relation to fear. All of our emotions are temporary. They will all move. And so if we keep our focus on present moment awareness, it's like the clouds in the sky, they will shift away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent comment, Michelle. I would wholeheartedly agree with that awareness and the groundedness, being aware of the fear. I think for me, what's really important about moving through fear and getting onto the other side of it is courage. It takes an immense amount of courage to be present and feel fear, and to let that pass, to let the clouds of the fear, of the emotion pass us. So, in a yoga practice, one of the ways that we develop courage is by doing postures that have a lot of fire energy. And they're intentionally called warrior poses because they're standing postures, they're expansive, the body opens, the heart and the chest are open, and the arms are stretched. It's a very tall, and strong posture. So I think on the other side of fear is courage, is calm, and how fabulous we feel when we have done something that has made us feel afraid, and how we need to be exposed to things in a safe way, of taking risks and be exposed to things that make us feel afraid, and knowing that we can get through that we are resilient, that we are capable, and that we can move through fear, and that groundedness and courage help us to move through that fear.
I like the concept of openness as being part of that counterbalance. I heard about a conversation among some anthropologists who were studying ecological relationships in different cultures, and they wanted to ask the question: what's the underlying singular similarity between a whole bunch of groups of people who had sustainable relationships to their environment? And they thought about it for a second and said ancestor worship. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, because we don't just take on sensible content and ideas from our ancestors. We take on their ideals too. Those things pass on to us as well as things like mythology encodes ecological relationships and understanding of specific bodily systems that we no longer have access to because of the kind of culture that we've grown up on and the kind of emphasis that it brings us in education. So there's an aspect of acknowledging what's beyond ourselves, which isn't as present under a materialistic paradigm, for example, or something highly geared towards economics. So when we have cultures, for example, that acknowledge they made it through a certain period of time through their relationship to corn and strawberries or something like that, right? There's an acknowledgement of something outside, something beyond, something open. So what I propose as the fundamental pole and opposite of fear, and you've probably heard this before, is love. Specifically in a way where the the unconditional element of love is brought to the forefront, because I did speak about the comfort involved in unconscious fear. There's a level of comfort, and even there's seeking out personal relationships of a certain sort in the fear state, in the depressive state. You know, sometimes we want to find people, we want to make connection, but on the level of fear, the way I'm looking at it here, we have something that's it forces us to be selfish. It's there's reasons for that. There's biological reasons for that. There's energetic reasons for that, because it's a contraction. It's a contraction that brings us within to a specific sphere of details that we're fixated upon. But love brings us to a outside of self state where we're open, we're acknowledging what's going on around us. So we can look at fear as involuntary selfishness. And when we engage with the relationship where we aspire to something beyond ourselves and we aspire to love unconditionally and acknowledge beings for as they are, then we can cultivate relationships that counterbalance that kind of selfishness that fear imposes upon us by placing ourselves within a broader community context.
Thank you, guys. I really, it's fascinating how, even though you guys come from very different disciplines and you bring really different worldviews to the table, how complementary you all are together. It's really neat. I wanted to open up the floor to our participants here today. I do have a couple other questions that had come through, but I'd like to give some other participants a chance to ask some questions to our panelists. Is there something that you'd like to explore today? They are at your disposal. You can unmute yourself and just ask directly through the microphone.
Hi there, this is Jerima.
Hi, Jem.
Hi, just multitasking and taking a shower at the same time. I arrived late, but I really resonate a lot with what Nicholas is speaking on. And I just wanted to ask, what is a good way to pay that homage to ancestors and do that one second love, that worship in a sense? And how do you find that that driving force that is your past self? I know I identify as being a leader or feeling a lot of guilt/strain in a time like this, because I know I have something to do in these times. And just, I guess my question is how to better connect to what that purpose is by way of ancestors or self and past lives and such.
Well, one important thing for sure is being kind to yourself. Because in acknowledging the ancestors, they live within you, right? So there's a strong need to actually have this relationship to your blood that is a reciprocity and a giving process, because the emotions that we experience in our outer relationships and our inner relationships, we are affecting our blood with everything we do. The perceptions that the things that we pay attention to, these things, they impress upon our blood, and the way that we actually focus our intention on what we're perceiving, it's the dynamic sort of like living molding process that you experience within your blood and within your system, and that's your legacy, right? As well as just being able to engage in your relationships in a meaningful way that you desire. So I recommend, if there's one thing right now, at this time, caring about yourself in a way that takes the burden of responsibility kind of off, because you know that really what you need to bring in is a strong sense of kindness and well, it's not a difficult, doesn't have to be a strenuous exercise to honor your ancestors and access your ancestors. It's sitting with yourself, because these memories, they live within you, and that relationship is one that's kind of unlocked through loving yourself. So you'll find understanding the core being of yourself as a being of love will actually help to bring that forward, and you'll experience yourself as the ancestor. That's a good way to engage that dialogue, is to experience yourself and the embodiment of yourself in a loving way, and that's one of the fundamentally most direct ways to actually engage in a relationship with your ancestors.
Michelle, you do a lot of ancestral work as well. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, shamanic journeying can be used as a way to access connection with your ancestors. And if you're not familiar with shamanic journeying, you can do it like as a meditation or a creative visualization, and ask to speak to the ancestors. I think it's important. Our ancestors are, had all their human foibles, and so there may be some who, even in the spirit realm, are not well beings. People don't, their perspective shifts when they cross over, but they may have things they're still working through on a soul level. So I always use the language of speaking to the ancestors who have loved me for always and since always. I really only want to be engaging with those that are on my side. And there may be those that just aren't in a place to be able to do that for reasons of their own soul's process. And there's another teacher whose name is escaping me, but who talks about engaging with our well ancestors, because those are the ones who have something to share with you. They're resourced enough to be able to do that. And really a process of just kind of hanging out and getting to know them. You can, in that journey or in that meditation, say, tell me about you, tell me about your life, and start to build a relationship, just as you would do with a friend that you are meeting for the first time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Is it okay for me to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, you can ask a follow-up question, and then we'll hear from Jayza.
Sure. So I feel like from both of you, that helps just confirm some things that I have been doing right. I did struggle with that openness. I do see that I have a gift with ancestors, but through the dream world, having, again, not those well ancestors present themselves as well in a very fearful way for me. The thing that I did was just ask, when I vision someone, just what is your name? Who are you? Why are you here? But that was really helpful. I just wanted to know if there's a way to protect that space in terms of the dream world. I see that me and my little one are very in tune. And for a 3-year-old experiencing that as well, it's kind of hard for me to explore this area, but also have that not well area opened as well.
Okay, Jem, I sent you a resource. I think you should. I think you should seek that out, because there are people that can deal directly with healing blood relationships and ancestral traumas that carry down. Some of which are extensive and quite complex, but can be worked with very effectively through the modality that I'm familiar with, that I've experienced myself. So I want to check that out.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, there are things that you can do to clear your space, clear your personal energy field, your living space. So that can be done through, like, burning sage or smudge, or through visualization practices. It's also, if you feel like there are beings in your space, you can put mirrors under your bed, and you could do this with your child as well. Put mirrors to reflect away any negative energies that may be intruding in your space.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, Jeza?
Yes, so I'm here with Jasper, my newborn. He's almost 6 weeks old. And so I do have a history of postpartum depression from my last miscarriage. And so I find with this 4th trimester period, with COVID happening and not being able to get out, at nighttime is when I'm most subject to being distracted by fearful thoughts. Like, I'll have moments of believing I'm not doing good enough. Will my son, will I be able to connect with him? Or maybe he won't love me back. Just these different fearful thoughts. And I'm curious to hear from either one, two, or all of you, if you had like a favorite practice that you could, prescribe to your clients that they could do, on their own when they are getting caught in these, fearful lies, or because I know they're not true, but I just get held on to them because at nighttime I'm tired and not being able to get out the last 6 weeks. I'm just not able to ground and center myself in the truth. I know there's also a lot of ancestral healing here happening for me as a first-time mom. So I know this is very work that's happening so it's not just a simple tool that I'm asking for. I know it's a sacred tool that I'm doing for decolonizing and etc.
Well, my go-to practice, and I have found myself, saying this to people a lot, especially over this last, 8 weeks, is to slow and deepen the breath. And I mean, I get that that's not everything that's needed, but when we slow and deepen the breath, it helps to calm the thoughts. And even the shift of the focus from the thoughts to the breath can help to break that cycle. And I like it because it's simple, it's accessible. Your breath is with you all the time, everywhere. It can be too much to kind of do a complicated like visualization practice, which those are really wonderful. But sometimes in the moment, especially if there's a feeling of overwhelm or fatigue, just slow and deepen the breath. It's right there. And my breathwork teacher used to say, if you don't know what to do, take a breath. And if you still don't know what to do, take another breath. Repeat as needed.
Thank you, Michelle. Very doable at nighttime.
I'll add to that. I just can't say enough about the importance of breath work. So great to remind us of that, Michelle. I had a few thoughts. Lovely to see a baby, by the way, on screen. And your grief and loss from miscarriage is a very real grief, and not a well understood grief and loss in our culture. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for sharing that with us today. And yeah, I find it interesting in what you said is that it's at the quiet of the night when you find it most difficult. And that tends to be the time that, you know, way back in our ancestry, we were potentially under more threat from predators. So I think there is a bit of a hard wiring for us to need to be safe at night. But also the distractions of daily activity, even though we are at home more now in this emergency pandemic time, we still are distracted by our phones, the internet, television, babies awake for you. So it's not until the quiet of the night that all of the sort of feelings and thoughts that are then under that more subterranean level start to come up. So just the timing of that is very understandable. One practice that I find helpful, and it's one that I'm learning a little bit more about, it's quite new to me, is to go to the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Stoic philosophy of, and one practice from a Stoic philosophy is one called the view from above, which is really taking us not in a dissociative way, because I do think we need to feel our emotions, we need to breathe through it, but to, in our mind, step a little bit away from the fear, to see it in perspective, the perspective of your life, the perspective of the generations and of time, and to see that the closeness of the fear and the immediacy of it, which is probably most disturbing, that when you get that different perspective, the fear starts to dissipate a little bit. And if I may, I just want to read something to you from the most recent issue of Psychology Today. It's the June 2020 issue. And it's about an article called The Illusion of Time. Gary Drevich is the author. So he talks about how, you know, at this time and place, most of us are in social distancing or in isolation because of the pandemic. So our experience of our emotions and time has really changed. So one of the things he says is research makes clear that in our minds, perceived time flies when we have happy experiences. It slows down when things are dull, and it nearly halts in times of danger or extreme stress, which is one reason we remember such moments so vividly. So, you know, having a newborn baby, your experience of time has completely changed, as well as being more isolated socially from the rest of the world has also changed. So I think that also really shifts the way we experience emotions, the way we feel them, and the way we move out from them. So I think that Stoic, you know, view from above, and you can Google it and read more about it, might be just a helpful way of thinking about what you're experiencing.
Thank you, Miranda. I appreciate the new perspective.
Is it okay if I ask you a question? Are you dreaming a lot lately when you're experiencing it?
I do. I was dreaming more in the first week, but
Okay.
I still do dream now.
Yeah. Have you been recording your dreams at all?
I have not.
No. Okay. And also, have you are you getting a lot of stimulation during the day? I'm just like wondering like what kinds of stimulation you're having, because you have the night times where it quiets up, right? So what's going on when it's not quiet?
Oh, well, for the last 6 weeks, I only got outside for 2 walks.
Oh my. Okay.
So I've been really struggling not to get out because I had a C-section with an infection, and so that really made it harder for me mentally.
Yeah. And are you reading, watching TV on the internet?
Yeah, I'm getting on social media.
Yeah.
I'm watching Netflix.
Like a lot?
I try, yeah, every day.
Okay. Because it's a possibility that just the contrast, right, from the level of stimulation, it just it makes it harder because you become attenuated to the stimulation. It becomes a little bit harder for stuff to come through clearly, and so it's kind of disruptive, right? And so
I
it
see
kind
what you mean. I am very stimulated in the day.
yeah. So then it takes a while for the stuff to kind of get through all that like stimulation, and so it kind of has
Right.
to like show itself in a really abrupt way for you.
Right.
So on the one hand,
Right.
maybe pay a bit more attention to the dreams, because that could help give you a kind of view from the other angle. And then back to what Miranda was saying, the view from above. Sometimes before going to sleep, it's good to take maybe 5-10 minutes and just like think about what you were doing during the day, and think about what you were thinking about, feeling as if from the outside, right? So instead of having this, I am thinking this and that, right? You have, okay, like this person thought this,
Yeah.
and then you can just move on, and then you don't get stuck into the loops of like, oh, and then what happens next in the thought. It's just like, this person thought that, they experienced that. And then it gives you a little bit of an overview, and it helps a lot going into sleep.
That's great. That helps me even more curious. I can observe it like a scientist, how the day
Yeah,
goes.
it really is kind of fun. Yeah.
Cool. I'll have fun with that. Thanks, Nicholas.
Okay, good, no problem.
And I'll just add one more thing if I can. This is more as a mother many years ago of newborns. The thing that saved me and helped me to sleep was progressive muscle relaxation, that creating of tension in the body and releasing. I did that every day for about a year, and then 2 years later, every day for about a year with my newborns. I just found it took me out of the day, and it prepared me for the night, physically, mentally. So if you haven't done progressive muscle relaxation, again, just Google it. There's lots available online about how to do that. And you know, that just saved me. So mother to mother, that's one thing I would suggest.
Thank you. Yeah, last time I did that a couple months ago, it did help me, and I haven't done it since then.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jayza. I have another question here. There's currently a lot of talk about the opportunity of manifesting a better tomorrow through thought. Would the panel agree? And if so, what guidelines could be offered?
So I've been doing a course with Sandra Engerman in this last few weeks, and she talks about this a lot. You know, our thoughts carry energy, they are real, and we have a culture where we don't necessarily, you know, collectively understand the impact of the energies that we're sending out. So, you know, she teaches really doggedly to take responsibility for the nature of our thoughts through compassionate observation. You know, she has a practice of reviewing every day. What thoughts was I sending out, and where did they go, and how could I do that better? And you know, I want to say that I think that you know, and also part of Sandra's teaching is that's not to say that we don't give expression to emotions even when they're not comfortable or pretty, because that's essential to our well-being. But there's a real important difference between expressing an emotion and sending it. So I know I've been guilty of being in traffic and somebody does something and I go, what a jerk, you know, and I've sent that energy out, as opposed to being self-responsible. I can still be annoyed, I can still be angry, but I don't want to be sending that out. And you know, if we can really clean up our act, everyone individually, attend to our thoughts, be self-responsible, and intentional about what it is we're sending out into our collective, and so that we're sending out love, light, joy, compassion for every living being, we can really transform the experience of every living being that's on the planet.
That's lovely, Michelle. When I think about fear, I think about now is what is our destiny with our fear? And I do think that's where we have the power of choice, and knowing ourselves, understanding ourselves, having that self-awareness is a crucial first step. But again, I ask, what is our destiny with fear? And what I see now, in this pandemic that we will be currently and will be facing for some time, is I see a lot of people's response to fear as finger pointing, blaming certain people as being the cause of the virus, blaming certain people for putting others at risk of further transmission. And I'm quite concerned about the destiny that kind of fear is taking us to. I would like for us as a collective to be thoughtful and intentional about our destiny individually, and our shared destiny with fear is that it should be at a place of calm, and it should be at a place of coming together and of finding opportunities to be a community and to help one another. So that means patience, kindness, and moving through our own kind of untapped emotions and really keeping them in check so that we aren't being reactive and angry at others through our fear, but that our destination for our fear is community and wholeness.
So I have just a thought on how we approach this relationship of thought and creating and going and living in life through an active relationship where thinking is an important part. So it's important to ask ourselves, how much skill do we exhibit in our thinking, and how much deliberateness is behind it? So thoughts and concepts that we're sympathetic to, they help sustain the willpower that we use to think them. But thinking in a way that challenges us, even challenging our boredom, for example, it helps make us free. It makes our will free. So if we don't have a connection between our thinking and our will, and this can be sustained through the creative force of feeling, we won't get very far. So if we want to create something for our lives, and we want to take an approach that leads from thinking, we need to become very agile in our feeling relationships, so that our thoughts can be sustained and move forward in a way that give substance to our will, so that our will can actually enter into the world. Because if our will's not there, then we're not going to do anything. We're going to think this or that because it entertains us at a given moment, and then when the time comes for the willpower to actually interface with our thinking, we might not have any steam because we haven't engaged our feeling to a sufficient degree.
Thank you very much. Oh, I have a question here. In our chat box here, you can all read it from Jem. Any advice on how to grow, connect on a deep level with a partner? I'm in Toronto, my partner's stuck in Buffalo. Screen time is painful, but it's the only visual source. We're wanting to explore meditation, tantra, etc. Jem, I know a couple people that I can connect with you with. There's two folks at the IAC that work with tantra and the body, and have moved much of their practice online. So you would be able to have like an intimate exploration together by Zoom, something guided and something, you know, safe for both of you. So I heard a child in the background. I know one of them is offering a Mother's Day special right now, so I'm not sure if it would extend to this, but maybe she's flexible. But I'll touch base with you personally, okay? Because I have your email, and I'll connect you with their profiles, and then you can take it from there. Does anybody else, in terms of the participants, have some questions? Have a question? It's almost 20 after, so we have time, I think, for one more question before we have a summary and closing for the day. If not, I do have one. Should I go for it? Hold on. Let's see. Let's see. What is one piece of practical advice you would give to somebody ready to look at the fear that they have within? One piece of practical advice if they feel like they're ready to look at this.
I can maybe start if that's okay. I think getting your own sort of personal safety in place is really important. So Michelle talked about some things around preparing your physical space in your home. I think you also need to prepare your space with your relationships and your support. Maybe reaching out to those people, letting them know that this is a journey that you are intending to go on, and connecting with them in a way that that they can maybe support and prepare themselves to be helpful. Also sort of noticing, are there things in your life that are maybe going to cause you harm as you are opening up some emotions. So, you know, substance use or, you know, other sort of, you know, choices in life that may be helpful or harmful. And trying to sort of get your kind of coping strategies in place, activity, exercise, sleep hygiene, all of those things. So I think just much the way you might prepare your garden before you plant is you need to turn the soil, prepare the soil before you can get into doing that emotional work. So that's one of the first things I would always recommend to people is just sort of prepare the space. Don't feel that you need to dive into it. Kind of get ready for it and know that it's going to be difficult, that you will get through it, and that you will, you know, be better off the more support you have around you. And also I think finding the right person, if you are choosing to do this with a helping, healing, therapy professional, taking some time to find the right person, because you can see someone on a website, look at their business card, but you really do need to have a connection with someone, and take a little bit of time to shop around and to see who's the best fit for you, and be a little bit patient with that. So those are two things I think are really important to do before you sort of initiate some of the more deeper emotional exploration and work.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, much the same. I would say start with a sense of compassion for yourself and make sure that you cultivate that self-compassion, and know that, you know, there's going to be days that feel difficult, and that's okay. There's going to be times that you get tripped up, and that's okay. That's part of the process of doing that inner dive. And then, you know, in choosing your support, whether that's professional support or whether you know, engage people in your life and your friends and family, do use some discernment with that. not everybody deserves to be part of that exploration of ourselves. So you want to choose support people that you know will hold space, that will refrain from judgment, that as best you can discern. You don't want people who are maybe dealing with their own uh, unexplored fear that might get actively triggered and try, because when that happens then people will try to shut down your experience, and not from no malice in that, they just don't have the mental emotional space to be present with it. So you just want to be cautious, and handle yourself and your inner life with care.
Yeah, so I would say definitely be ready to acknowledge yourself as a person with many facets. Whatever you might be looking at, it might seem very comprehensive, and it is very comprehensive. Whatever fear system or a facet of yourself will be comprehensive when you look at it. But yeah, let it kind of sit for a bit. Just after going through some deep introspection, maybe go for a new experience, quiet reflection, be present to your surroundings, and that'll just help you. It'll help you bring you back to again that world, right? We go introspective, and then enter back into that relationship of the outer world and new experiences, so that you don't get stuck in the past after exploring it a little bit. Yeah, and like Michelle said, do ground into your own independence. Experience that, recognize that, because there will be feelings of sociability, attachments, and things like that can come up when we look at our fear aspects. But it also gives us a strong sense of self that we can kind of experience inwardly in a quiet way, as we're following through in our experiences and just encountering our worlds again, our outer worlds, inner worlds, all that.
Thank you. I hope that answered your questions. There's 4 minutes remaining. If anybody has a dying question, they're just like, or they're inquisitive about an aspect of fear that they'd like to explore before we sign off for today. Okay. Well, I would just like to say thank you to everybody for being present today. I know fear isn't necessarily a fun topic, and by showing up especially at this time in life with everything that's going on, it's important to have these conversations. And I really do hope that you were given some tools and some resources that will help you frame fear, identify it, understand it, and move through it. And certainly if you would like to reach out to Nick or Michelle or Miranda for a session or for advice, they're available for you after this is complete. Michelle, Miranda, and Nick, in the comments section, would you mind leaving your websites and your information there so folks can access it and take note? And I'll be sending that to folks as well afterwards. Thank you also for just tuning into this series. It's intended to be a resource to help us move through these challenging times and difficult emotions and experiences, so that we can really ripple out those effects in our families and our communities and make a better future for all of us. Next week on Wednesday, we're exploring self-care. I know that did come up a couple of times today in terms of looking at yourself with some self-compassion, with love. seeing yourself as the ancestor and the importance of caring for you. And that can be challenging at the best of times, let alone right now. So that's what we'll be exploring next week. And the week following is going to be focused on anxiety and depression. So stay tuned for those talks. In the meantime, I wish you all well. I hope you all the best as you navigate this relationship with fear as it comes up in your life. And thank you so much, Michelle, Miranda, and Nick, for stepping forward to explore this conversation and offer all your tips and resources. So in a complimentary fashion, so that it can be accessible for everybody. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks. It was
Thank
great
you.
to be here.
Thank you.